I'm Marie Dorini. I'm the Administrative Director of the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. I'm just going to quickly give the stage to James Graham, who's a fellow of Ralph Ghoche's and who's also an architectural historian at GSAP at Columbia. Just one note, we've cancelled the talk for next week because of the grève, which is Bouchra Khalili's talk. It will be rescheduled at some point in January, and so please check our website regularly. Thank you very much.
Hey everyone. So just to echo Marie, welcome to this Rendez-vous de l'Institut. And thank you so much for the invitation to introduce a friend and colleague, Ralph Ghoche. It's really a pleasure to do this. So this is our fourth rendezvous on the year, and so far we've seen some wide-ranging presentations from the visual history of walking to how we judge the truth of stories to the after effects of nuclear weapons testing. And since I tend to see things through my own sort of disciplinary frame of architecture, I can't help but maybe detect a particular thread that runs through those talks around questions having to do with how power gets distributed in space, or how things like knowledge and agency are always in some way tied to the sort of context that they're being practiced in. And I think that's something we're going to certainly encounter tonight in Ralph's talk titled Erasing the Ketchaoua Mosque, Catholicism, Assimilation, and Civic Identity in France and Algeria. So within our shared field, which is architectural history, the story of Algerian architecture is in the 19th and 20th century has often been told through the sort of iconic work of a cadre of well-known, mostly French architects working within the colonial and post-colonial context of the city of Algiers, Viollet-le-Duc, Le Corbusier, Oscar Niemeyer, or Fernand Pouillon, just to name some of them. These are, of course, I think, very meaningful histories, but they're also very partial ones. And it seems to me that Ralph's work in Algeria is contributing to a sort of broader turn within architectural history to explore how institutions affect change through the built environment well beyond singular known buildings. Or in the case of Ralph's topic tonight, how architectural meaning is no simple or stable thing, even when it seems to be embodied in a sort of unquestionably monumental object. And in fact, I think the architectures of colonization or decolonization, I mean, they work systemically, even as it also works through architecture's ability to sort of represent something. And something I really admire about Ralph's work is its attunement to both of those poles at the same time. The idea that architecture is a sort of legible object that we can read and interpret, but that at the same time, it sort of, he works through architecture's kind of, shall we say, the way it can obscure power, whether governmental, social, economic, or in this case, religious, obscure the way that power circulates through architectural objects. So to conclude, Ralph teaches in the Department of Architecture at Barnard College, where we've had the chance to teach together, in fact. He holds degrees in architecture from McGill University and a PhD in architectural history from Columbia. And he has a book coming out next year on theories of ornament, archaeology, and aesthetics in 19th century French architecture, which I'm looking forward to very much, having encountered earlier snippets of that work. And without listing too many things, I'll just say that he's a prolific contributor to the world of architectural discourse, and I think well beyond it, given his investment in architecture's relations to things like empire, diaspora, or religion. So please join me in welcoming Ralph Ghoche.
Thank you, James, for those very generous comments. And thank you to the Institute, and to especially to Marie, to Eve, and to James, and of course to Mark, who unfortunately won't be able to join us today. So I'll be reading it's actually an article that was it's a version of an article that was very recently published in a edited volume edited by Daniel Koslett, called Neocolonialism and the Built Heritage. And I would add that this is fairly new work, so it'll be, I think, to me, it's very good to read this and in public, especially knowing that there are a number of people from French context here who I can learn a lot from. Touche pas à mon église. Don't touch my church, reads the cover of the July 2015 issue of Valeurs Actuelles, a French conservative news magazine. The slogan and the movement that it sparked were devised in response to comments made by the rector of the Paris Grand Mosque, Dalil Boubaker, in a televised interview a month earlier. Asked whether disused churches in France could be transformed into places of Islamic worship, Boubaker had paused momentarily and answered, quote, "Why not? It is the same God. The rites are similar, fraternal. I think that Muslims and Christians can coexist." The reply generated controversy, as it seemed to feed suspicions fueled by the growing power of identitarian movements that a grander cultural displacement of the white Christian population by French Muslims was underway. So fierce was the backlash that Boubaker published a retraction soon after the interview. The author of the Valeurs Actuelles article, Denis Tillinac, though himself a conservative Catholic, performed some masterly sleights of hand as he shifted the ground of debate from religion to cultural values, from Christianity to such French Republican convictions as secularism and freedom of speech. He spoke of churches less as objects of religious worship than as sites for the preservation of national identity, rooted in cultural landscapes and historical memory. The slogan, "Don't touch my church," too, was deceptive and calculated, as it co-opted the famous anti-racist slogan, "Touche pas à mon pote," or "Don't touch my friend or my buddy," that issued from marches in the mid-1980s, condemning a wave of race-based violence against the adolescents of North African descent. Tillinac included a petition with the article, and while it garnered 25,000 signatures within a day, its first signatory attracted the most attention, the center-right former president, Nicolas Sarkozy. Indeed, the issue gained popular support and cut across political lines in France. Polling revealed that 67% of the public were supportive of measures that prohibit the conversion of churches into mosques. The debate over the conversion of churches in France, not to say the veritable restrictions over the construction of minarets and new mosques in Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, point to a renewed backlash against more inclusive models of European citizenship advanced in prior decades. Indeed, in the recent past, the heads of state of France, the UK, Germany, and Spain have all proclaimed the failure of multiculturalism. While politicians may declare the end of multicultural policies, I might add that most governments in Europe have never instituted nor endorsed, the cultural diversity of life in Europe's urban centers is more difficult to deny. In France, where multiculturalism has been treated with some antipathy across the political spectrum, the visibility of ethnic and racial minorities on the street is not reflected in the nation's laws and constitution. Indeed, French legislators have tended to set citizenship against personal identity and have asserted Republican values over and against the recognition of minority groups. For example, Article 1 of the French Constitution pits, quote, "the equality of all citizens before the law" against any, quote, "distinction of origin, race, or religion," rendering these minority distinctions juridically invisible. As Achille Mbembe has explained, quote, "the perverse effect of its indifference to difference is thus the relative indifference to discrimination." In the wake of the professed failure of multiculturalism, prominent politicians and scholars have urged that we return to an idea with a long and fraught history, assimilation. Those, like Sarkozy, who have sought to rehabilitate the term, stress the responsibility of immigrants and their descendants to demonstrate their public attachment to French values, while suppressing their cultural and religious heritage or relegating these to the private sphere. Attempts to rebrand the concept of assimilation run parallel to recent governmental efforts at curtailing discussion of France's colonial legacy. Indeed, issues of minority visibility and cultural integration always seem to come back to the question of colonialism. Once a byword for the colonial policies of cultural violence, mechanisms of assimilation in the 19th century aimed to absorb and erase the identity of colonial subjects into French singularity. But if these policies were previously directed at colonial subjects located on territory d'outre-mer, that is to say, beyond continental Europe, discussions of assimilation today have centered on citizens and permanent residents of mainland France. So today I'll look back to the French colony of Algeria in the opening decades of the modern colonial era, in the period between 1830, the year of France's conquest of Algiers, to 1870, just before the consolidation and mass colonization of Algeria under the government of the Third Republic. It was during these years that the modern concept of assimilation was forged. If the question of assimilation today has run parallel to debates on visible markers of Islam in the public sphere, in 19th century Algiers, assimilationist policies also helped forge the architectural identity of the city. As with today's debate over the consensual conversion of disused churches, forcible conversion emerged as a key tactic by French administrators to shape urban life in colonial Algeria. Indeed, between 1830 and 1862, buildings serving Muslim religious needs in occupied Algeria were reduced from 176 to a mere 21. In Algiers alone, at least 3 of its 5 Catholic churches, including the Cathedral of Algiers, which is in fact the focal point of this present talk, were housed in mosques that were expropriated. And here I'm just showing you an image from 1973 of a mosque that was once a mosque, converted in 1843 into the Church of Notre-Dame des Victoires, and then upon independence reconverted to a mosque. What is clear is that architecture has always been an important instrument in the process of framing citizenship and identity. This is something that the Touche pas à mon église movement knew all too well. Indeed, a close reading of Tillinac's polemic shows that it centers, above all else, on the fear that the resignification of churches into mosques would have a disruptive effect on national culture. In other words, at the very center of these debates is the concern that architecture might come to represent a differentiated form of citizenship, rather than reproduce majoritarian norms, practices, and traditions, some long since eroded of meaning. If today Tillinac's movement has insisted on the relative historical purity of France's architectural heritage as a way of enforcing cultural integration, an altogether different tactic was introduced in the 19th century Algeria, in order to ensure the, quote, pacification and submission of the Algerian population, architectural hybridity and eclecticism. Even the famous neo-Gothic architect Eugène-Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, who waged a long campaign to uphold a purified account of the rise of the Gothic that was free of foreign influences, transformed his architectural vocabulary in a radical way in Algeria, where he infused his design for a commemorative monument with stylistic idioms drawn from Islamic and North African architectures. In the hands of the Catholic Church, architectural eclecticism emerged in 19th century Algiers as a style of forcible assimilation, one geared towards France's new expansionist footing. Style in the 19th century was an intensely political and ideological phenomenon. In France, Romantic architects erected buildings with hybrid conjunctions of styles as a way to convey their sense of history's past and future trajectory. Buildings such as Henri Labrouste Sainte-Geneviève Library, which you probably all know, not too far from here, across from the Panthéon, for example, portrayed France as the rightful heir of the westward migration of knowledge from Asia Minor to Greece and Rome. Visitors moved through the pre-classical entrance hall, up through the Renaissance staircase, and into the modern iron-supported reading room. In other words, as they moved through physical and geographical space, they also proceeded through historical time. And I just want to point out, if there's one moment that emphasizes or illustrates this point very clearly, it's the decision by Labrouste to have a copy of the School of Athens by Raphael painted on the wall of the staircase, so that essentially illusionistically reproduces the very arches that enter into the modern space of the reading room. And so if you can think of the School of Athens, right, what does the School of Athens illustrate? It illustrates the movement of knowledge from Greece to Rome, to the Vatican. And here displaces that movement, or continues that trajectory very much into the kind of modern space of 19th century France. Transplanted to Algerian soil, the worldview that animated Romantic architects and produced some of Paris's most celebrated landmarks would serve as a mandate for the appropriation and destruction of the cultural heritage of a people. The buildings they erected recombined architectural elements in such a way as to validate France's expansion into North Africa, a conquest that was based on the premise of bringing civilization back to its original cradle in the, quote, Orient. Here was an architecture of assimilation, insofar as it aimed to absorb and integrate the architectural heritage of Algeria, as foreign and alien as it might have been, into the consummate body of French identity. Scholars have seen the practice of incorporating local and Arabic building forms into French colonial architecture as a phenomenon that emerged in the late 19th century and culminated in the rise of the so-called style Jonnard. The style was named after the Governor-General of Algeria, Charles Jonnard, who mandated the use of neo-Mauresque elements in the design of public buildings in the first decades of the 20th century. At first glance, the neo-Mauresque buildings in Algeria appear to operate as reconciliatory images, elaborate and alluring displays suggesting the coexistence of two cultures, French and Algerian. This is the way that they have tended to be interpreted. In Arabizing, an exhaustive study of neo-Mauresque architecture in North Africa, François located the origins of such stylistic hybrids in Napoleon III's Arab kingdom policy of 1865, and in the new conservationist ethos of the Second Empire. The process of, quote, Arabization of colonial architecture for Béguin reflected an interest in presenting France's, quote, protecting and, quote, paternal influence in the colonies, and thus marked a shift from, quote, armies and wars to what he called, quote, political and psychological action. 50 years before Jonnard's policies were put into effect, however, the Catholic Church, working in conjunction with Romantic architects, spearheaded the deployment of such architectural hybrids in Algiers. Buildings such as the Cathedral of Algiers, shown here, the Great Seminary at Cuba, and the Basilica of Notre-Dame d'Afrique were among the first colonial edifices in Algeria to integrate elements drawn from building traditions in the Middle East, North Africa, and Islamic Iberia. The spate of religious buildings erected in Algiers in the mid-19th century complicates the view that the introduction of Arabizing elements into French colonial architecture served as conciliatory gestures. Looked at through the lens of the assimilationist theories of the age, particularly those propagated by church figures in Algeria, Béguin's reading proves as deceptive as it is dangerous. Assimilation as a set of practices and policies in the French colonial period has a complex history. Most scholars chart the prevalence of assimilationist policies in French colonies as running parallel to the extent to which governmental administrations adhered to republican values. Modern assimilationist theories emerged with the rise of Enlightenment ideals and were first applied as state policy by the National Convention a few years after the Revolution of 1789. These policies were curtailed significantly during Napoleonic rule and the Bourbon Restoration, although, quote, the spirit of assimilation remained among certain segments of the government, eventually leading to the introduction of modern assimilationist policies during the liberal constitutional monarchy of Louis Philippe. With the Republican Revolution of 1848, assimilationist policies resurfaced in a much more overt way, most notably with the Constitution of November 4th, 1848, which stated that the colonies were an integral part of French territory. The Constitution led to the division of Algeria into 3 departments, Alger, Oran, and Constantine, with representatives elected to the French Parliament. Policy shifted again during the last decade of the Second Empire, in this case towards a new colonial ideal, albeit a contradictory one, which purported to respect the institutions of native Algerians while supporting the gradual acculturation of Algerians to French social norms. Quote, France has not come to destroy the nationality of a people, Napoleon III exclaimed on his tour of Algiers in 1865. Addressing Algerians directly, he continued, quote, I want to increase your well-being, include you more and more in the ruling of your country, as well as in the benefits of civilization, end quote. In comparison to the fluctuating levels of governmental interest in instituting assimilationist policies in Algeria, the Catholic Church wavered little in its resolve to assimilate the Algerian population. In private channels, the church leaders employed the established term for such practices, religious conversion. In more public forms, however, terms like, quote, assimilation and, quote, education were used to convey the same message in a veiled manner. The duplicity was the result of a prohibition on proselytizing to non-Christians by the Minister of War in Paris, who administered religious affairs in Algeria until 1848. The parts of Algeria that were, quote, pacified in the first dozen years of French rule were relatively small and largely urban, and French administrators sought to quell tensions with inhabitants. Moreover, anti-clericalism still pervaded military ranks during the July monarchy. The first bishop of Algiers, Antoine Louis Adolphe Dupuche, was in fact forced to resign in 1845 as a result of his missionary zeal, which had put him at odds with the Minister of War and especially with Thomas Bugeaud, the Governor General of Algeria. The Algerian church was still in its infancy when Dupuche was obliged to leave the bishopric. While priests and chaplains were on board the first ships to dock in Algiers during the invasion of 1830, the Catholic Church was only officially installed in the territory in 1838, with the signing of a papal bull establishing the Diocese of Algiers. The Church's arrival in Algeria was celebrated as a reconquest of territory that had been Roman and Christian before the spread of Islam across North Africa. Dupuche played a central role in propagating the impression of French colonialism in Algeria as a historic revival of the spirit of Augustinian Christendom. And here, just to show you the way that the French envisioned Algeria, really through the eyes of Romans, of the past colonizers, Romans, and of course through the eyes of in some cases, the Catholic Church. And this is among the many maps that were drawn in the early years. Also, maps were drawn that essentially placed all the kind of historical Roman and Christian sites. And lot of Christian archaeology that will take place as well in the first decades of the burgeoning colony. Relations between the church and colonial administrators improved significantly with the removal of Dupuche and the installation of Louis-Antoine Augustin Pavie, who presided over the diocese from 1846 to 1866. Pavie was more delicate than his predecessor in his dealings with officials in the government. His efforts were rewarded as funding for church building projects measurably increased during his tenure. And here it's an incredible map that essentially places all of the parishes in colonial Algeria. It's a map dating to 1864, so really just 2 years before the end of Pavie's tenure. And in that time, between Dupuche and Pavie, number of parishes increased from 24 to 187. So you can see the kind of tremendous increase. But little advancement was made on the issue of the conversion of Algerians, as governmental officials in Algeria and Paris remained firmly opposed. As one of his biographers explained, on this issue, Pavie's hands, quote, were tied. Despite governmental prohibitions, Pavie was no less committed to evangelization than was Dupuche, though he employed tactics that were less conspicuous. In public, Pavie presented Christianity in much the same way as the government had, as a tolerant religion that promoted universal values. But in private channels, he maintained that the ultimate goal of the church remained the conversion of Algerians. These aims were laid out in the statutes governing the new diocese that were distributed to the clergy in Algeria. In the chapter titled Relations avec les infidèles, in the 1849 edition of the statutes, Pavie reminded priests to, quote, never lose sight of our mission towards the indigenous and neglect nothing that hastens the desired moment of their conversion. Given the government ban on religious conversion, Pavie recommended that clergymen spend time, quote, learning Arabic, the Quran, and the habits and culture of the indigenous in order to insinuate themselves more easily into the inner being, the term he uses, esprit, of Algerians, and even to show them, on occasion, the wrong-headedness and immoral nature of their beliefs, end quote. Children, Pavie continued, should be particular targets of evangelization. He recommended luring them into churches and schools where they could be more effectively re-educated. Pavie's recommendations emboldened Abbé Loyer, a priest in the Saharan town of La Rouate, who published De l'Assimilation des Arabes in 1866. The book was written as a rebuttal of Napoleon III's project for an Arab kingdom, inaugurated during the emperor's second visit to Algeria the year earlier. If the so-called Arab kingdom policy urged respect for Algerian society and sought coexistence, albeit an unequal one, between French settlers and Algerians, Loyer advocated for the elimination of Algerian cultural institution. What was needed to solve the, quote, Arab question, he argued, was a two-pronged strategy. First, the destruction of the, quote, Arab nationality, to be followed by its reconstitution into French identity. The final goal, Loyer explained, was for, quote, the Arab to no longer to be what he has been, and for him to become what he is not yet, that is, French. Loyer recommended a number of tactics, each more devious than the next. Brute force, he claimed, had not achieved assimilation. Neither had soft power approaches, like the creation of the Bureau Arabe, institutions formed as links between Algerians and the French. Moreover, Loyer criticized the first bishop of Algiers for his overt methods of converting Algerians to Catholicism. What was needed were, quote, clandestine means. He laid out two such tactics. First, he called for members of the clergy to remake themselves into marabout, the Maghrebi term for Muslim religious leader, in order to penetrate Algerian society and gain the trust of tribal members. Second, he proposed that French juvenile delinquents and orphans, boys and girls, be embedded primarily through marriage into Algerian tribal families. The idea being that as they would grow up and gained awareness of their French identity, they could change Algerian society really from the inside. The tactics recommended by Loyer, as those by Pavie before him, all involved some form of hybridization, whether through intermarriage or through the deliberate adoption of local language, custom, and dress. The ultimate aim, both men made clear, should not be misinterpreted. Assimilation was an instrument of counter-insurgency and of conquest, quote, to render insurrection nearly impossible, Loyer writes. And it entailed the destruction of Algerian culture and not the creation of a new syncretic society. For Loyer, the, quote, Arab needed to be, quote, absorbed into us, melted, melded, made submissive, and pacified, end quote. The most pressing threat to France's colonial mission, Loyer declared, was the, quote, Arabization of the Frenchman. Assimilation was clearly conceived to act in one direction only. If mechanisms of assimilation entailed the destruction of Algerian cultural institutions, at an urban scale they involved the demolition, conversion, and resignification of buildings, landscapes, and monuments. Saint Philippe Cathedral was the most glaring example of such aims put into practice. At its origin, the church was the product of the forcible Christianization of one of the most revered Ottoman-era buildings in Algiers, the Ketchaoua Mosque. The conversion of the building was carried out in a particular brutal way. At noon on December 18th, 1832, 2 years following France's military conquest of the city, French troops stormed the mosque, which had been barricaded by 4,000 worshippers amassed inside in order to stop its conversion. At the time, the Ketchaoua Mosque was the most prestigious of Algiers' religious buildings and stood at the center of the city, adjacent the former palace of the Ottoman Dey. And that's the palace. So this is the palace of the Dey, and that's the old Ketchaoua Mosque. The palace would be converted to the palace of the governor, and of course the mosque would be turned into the cathedral. The order to forcibly convert the mosque was given by the governor who understood the symbolic importance of appropriating the pre-colonial seats of governmental and religious power and acted in contravention to a clause in the instrument of Algiers' surrender that guaranteed that Muslims would retain their place of worship. The brazen violation caused consternation even among some French officials. The Christian cross and French flag were immediately hoisted up on the building, and cannons fired from a nearby naval flotilla in celebration. The first Mass was held in the building. The first Mass held in the building was celebrated on Christmas Eve, just a week later, after modest transformations were undertaken, adding a Christian altar and incorporating the statue of the Virgin Mary into the mihrab niche. The church was officially upgraded to cathedral status with the creation of the Diocese of Algiers in 1838, and it was dedicated to the French king, Louis Philippe. The year following the creation of the diocese, French military administrators, in conjunction with religious authorities, embarked on a decades-long process of transforming the cathedral in order to accommodate the growing number of officials, merchants, and colonists settling in Algiers. In fact, there were about 117,000 Europeans in Algeria by 1848. By the end, no visible part of the original mosque building remained. Pierre-Auguste Ghoche, the first of many architects to work on the project, presented plans for the construction of the building in 1842, 1843, and 1848. As the drawings of the retrofit show, initial work on the building encapsulated or quite literally swallowed up the old mosque within a new shell. The architect's intention to salvage the interior of the mosque was clearly rendered in the first drawings of the project, as was his aim to provide a new facade that reflected the Islamic character of the original mosque and its setting. And you can see in black is the original mosque and the parts that are proposed to be added to the mosque. Construction began on the facade, a choir, and the base of a new tower soon after Ghoche's first design was prepared in 1848. Following Pavy's appointment as Bishop of Algiers in 1846, relations with the architects, which had been quite strained under Dupuche, improved significantly as Pavy began to play a more prominent role in the process of planning the renovation. This, along with important changes in governance in the late 1840s, assured that the Catholic Church greater control over the design of the cathedral. Indeed, a report on the state of the cathedral in 1853 by the Parisian architect Léon Vaudoyer made specific mention of the close collaboration between diocesan architects working on the cathedral and the Bishop Pavy. Vaudoyer singled out its design by Romain Arroux Romain, Ghoche's successor, as having been produced, quote, under the inspiration of the bishop. The drawing bears the marks of the bishop's admiration. And it says here, translated into English, "It is with the rarest satisfaction that I have seen and studied the drawing of the facade planned for my cathedral." And those are the words of Pavy himself. The design reworked, and so this is a detail of this larger drawing proposal. The design reworked Ghoche's facade with its subdued incorporation of local forms into a frenzied mergence of elements drawn from Islamic and Christian architectural traditions. Stone surfaces were rendered into intricate geometric latticework that evoked Byzantine and Moorish patterns. Corbels were remodeled into muqarnas, and multifoil arches recalling archways in the Cordoba Mosque, of course a fitting image given the building's conversion during the Iberian Reconquista, were introduced above the entrance portico. A bishop's balcony over here, which is very odd, in fact, was added at the center of the composition, flanked by representations of St. Augustine, the 4th century Christian theologian, and Bishop of Hippo Regius, which during French times was named Beaune, and now the city is called Annaba, and Cyprian, a 3rd century Berber convert and Bishop of Carthage in Tunisia. If the composite nature of the scheme might seem to gesture towards the reconciliation of the two central religions in colonial Algeria, it is more likely that it reflected Pavy's assimilationist ideals that proposed employing the outward expression of Algerian culture as a clandestine measure to destroy Algerian religious identity. Indeed, while the scheme was never realized and Ghoche's facade remained unchanged until the end of the century, the architects who replaced Arroux Romain continued the strategy of intermixing Christian and Islamic elements, albeit in a less ostentatious way. Starting in 1852, the last traces of the mosque were demolished, including the impressive octagonal dome and the surrounding marble columns and cupolas, and replaced with a barrel vault, which you see over here and in section over here. You can see some of the old constructions remain. In fact, the columns are replaced and used. The old columns of the mosque are reused in the scheme. Some years later, a dome was erected over the new choir and a crypt installed beneath. The destruction of the Ketchaoua Mosque was followed by the building's reconstitutions in a hybridized form. The dissonant effect produced by the juxtaposition of Islamic elements, architectural elements, topped with Christian religious symbols, was not accidental. for it aimed to break the cultural association between the form of the building and its spiritual function in Islamic and Algerian society. In other words, it aimed to make clear to the onlooker that the French held ultimate mastery and control over the culture of the colonized. The particular way in which the two architectonic vocabularies were conjoined likewise expressed French supremacy over its Muslim colonial subjects. The architects of the cathedral reconfigured the prevailing narratives that saw the Romanesque and the Gothic as emerging from Islamic building traditions in such a way as to make the Romanesque appear as the progenitor of Islamic architecture. This is most clear in the way that the Romanesque buttresses that line the lateral wall of the church quite literally support the Islamic cupolas. The subtle misconstrual reinforced conventional European ideas regarding Arab architecture that characterized it as excelling in decoration, but as indifferent to structural expression. These Orientalist assumptions reflected more widespread prejudices that saw the West as masculine and rational, and the Orient as feminine and passive. Situated between the Kasbah and the port in an area subjected to major building and demolitions, the cathedral presented a dramatic contrast to the repetitive neoclassical buildings rising up in parallel formation around it. Indeed, in the first decades of the colonial occupation, there were no imposing Christian buildings, and the few places of Christian worship that did exist in Algiers were housed in repurposed buildings without notable exterior expression. The absence of visible markers of Christianity in the city concerned church leaders who believed that if native Algerians lacked respect for their colonizer, it was because they perceived them to be insufficiently religious. They cited, for example, the criticism of the Emir Abdelkader, the Algerian religious and military leader who led a rebellion against French occupation. Your religion, but you do not have religion, Abdelkader reportedly stated during the signing of the Tafna Treaty in 1837, adding that, quote, if you were Christians, as you pretend to be, you would have priests, churches, and we would be the best of friends. The renovation of St. Philippe Cathedral was thus envisioned as a monumental expression of Catholicism's importance in the life of the colonizers, and as a definitive statement of the church's renewed presence in North Africa. It operated as a piece of architectural seduction, aggrandizing the church's presence in Algiers in order to gain the respect of Algerians, while indigenizing Christianity within foreign soil. The cathedral remained much the same way as it was in the 19th century when on July 5th, 1962, the day of Algerian independence from France, a group of 800 men and women rushed inside, seeking to reclaim it as the central mosque of the city. The church's perspective on the colonization of Algeria had shifted demonstratively since the beginning of the colonial enterprise, some 132 years earlier. Important figures in the church expressed sympathy towards Algerians during the long and bloody struggle, and some, like the Archbishop of Algiers, Léon Étienne Duval, went as far as to support the principle of self-determination of Algeria. Nonetheless, the momentary occupation of the cathedral by the Algerian crowd sparked something of a crisis of conscience among church officials in Algiers. And on October 25th, 1962, Mohamed Duval, as he was called by the French Algerians who very much hated the Archbishop, signed a decree deconsecrating the cathedral. The Ketchaoua Mosque officially reopened on the anniversary of the outbreak of the Algerian Revolution a few weeks later. While the building was entirely transformed since it last served Muslim worshippers, the towers, horseshoe arches, geometric tile work, and countless outer details from Islamic building traditions made for a natural fit for a revived Muslim prayer. Most recently, the Ketchaoua Mosque has re-entered public consciousness in the wake of the debates regarding Islamic spaces of worship in France. Critics of the Touche pas à mon église movement, if one could even call it a movement, it petered out so quickly, have seen the building and its double conversion from a mosque to a church and back into a mosque as presenting an instructive parallel to the recent polemic. If today the suggestion to convert certain disused churches into mosques in a consensual manner has ignited public opinion, the indignation is at best disingenuous, given the forcible conversions that haunt French colonial history. Thank you. So there are time for some questions.
What happened to the governor's building next door?
The governor's building is, so this is a photo taken very recently. As you know, I went to Algeria about a month ago, and it's closed for repair. I mean, all the buildings that were owned by the church prior to 1905, the year of the famous law, basically reverted from, actually they weren't owned by the church, they were owned by the state, and they went from being owned by the French state to being owned by the Algerian state. And so the building is a governmental building. I can't recall what its used, what its use is today. As I say, it's closed. The building in front, which you see here, was the évêché. In fact, the larger project really will focus really on that square because there's this kind of tensions that you see between the military and the church are really played out on that square. In fact, the name of the square changes dozens of times in the 19th century, from Place du Gouvernement, Place de la Cathédrale, Place de l'Évêque, etc. And so you can see the tensions between these two powers played out. But yeah, this was the évêché. Across, as you saw, was the governor, and then that was the cathedral. Today, this is owned by maybe the Minister of Tourism. It was also closed. So the two are courtyard, beautiful, beautiful courtyard buildings built during Ottoman rule. You can see, so that's taken inside the évêché. So these kind of incredible columns and stonework and etc. Mercedes.
Yeah, I wonder if you could say. Well, I don't think I need. A voice.
Oh no, but it's good to have it so that it's recorded on the.
No, I wonder if you could say something, or if you came upon something regarding the Egyptian minarets of the church. Yeah. Because they're quite odd if you want to
and they are taken
Christianity. So I wonder if you came across references on this. Do they speak about this?
So I have not. I'm dying to find primary source description of the minarets. Why they chose to base them on, as you say, they're completely Egyptian, is not very clear. Giraud de Prangly was taking photos of these. So I mean, the images of mosques in Egypt were coming out around this time. So there's very it was in the air, but I haven't really seen any documents that explain why they chose that particular language.
But then if I can go further, it means that they had no idea about Algerian architecture, or they didn't try to
Yes.
understand, or even to survey, or to even look at Algerian architecture.
they were beginning to survey, so they were starting to learn. But again, I think, to unpack these things, one has to unpack and understand better, and this is the work I'm trying to do, understand better the way that the French conceived of Algeria in relation to, as you said, the l'Orient of Egypt and the Middle East, in relationship to Andalusia and the Islamic past in Iberian Peninsula. And I think, of course, around this same time, you have a number of books about Iberian architecture, Islamic Iberian architecture, that are coming out, and so, but it's still somewhat flou for me in terms of where they're basing their direct sources.
So just along the same line, can you explain the Stars of David on the front of the cathedral?
I've asked a number of people. It's odd. Of course, the Stars of David are also, they're originally a Judaic symbol, but they're adopted by Christianity. But why such prevalent display of Stars of David? It is very odd. Let me just, it's actually just a slide. It is very odd, and then what I would say is the French are, if you read the impressions of, say, de Tocqueville when he arrives in Algiers, right, and a number of other visitors, they're very, very taken aback by actually multiculturalism in Algiers, in Algeria. They're very surprised to see not a monolithic state with a monolithic people, but a lot of diversity. And they're obsessed with representing the various types Algérien, so the Maure, le Juif, l'Arabe, le Berbère, etc., etc. And so this is definitely on their radar, and this may be a way to point to the, if they're pointing to what they think, if they think they're pointing to Algerian Muslims with the minarets, then maybe the Stars of David are pointing to that other part of the diverse segment of Algerian society. But it is unclear why such a prominent display would be chosen.
I feel actually silly asking this question, but to go back to the very beginning of your presentation, are you aware, are there any instances of shared places of worship, either in France or Algeria?
Well, I don't know about Algeria, but in France there were a few churches that opened. This is predating the Touche pas à mon église movement, that opened their prayer spaces to Muslims and shared those spaces, because, as everyone knows, many of the church buildings remain almost vacant, sometimes even boarded up, unused in France, and yet the Muslim population in Algeria is increasing, and so there have been consensual agreements made between Christian churches or Catholic churches and Muslim groups. But in Algeria, I'm not sure. There are still churches in Algeria, and there's still Sunday prayer, and not all that many, but very few Christians. There are churches, but very few Christians in Algeria remaining today.
Thank you, Raf. I was wondering if you could say a few words about the transformations made to the mosque since 1962. What specific architectural details have been erased or, on the contrary, valued? And especially the last restoration, the Turkish restoration of 2015 or something.
I have a few. I had to be very discreet in photographing the interior of now mosque. And I'm still working on the interiors themselves are fascinating. I mean, look at this. This space behind the altar was actually under the dome, and then there's this kind of incredible light streaming down with these 9 cupolas, a kind of 9 square grid behind the altar. Sorry, I'm not getting to your question, but I'll get to it in a second. And then the way that the building is designed as a kind of as a repository of relics from all over Algeria. So these columns are taken from a temple of Neptune in Cherchel. The crypt below is built to house the body of Saint Geronimo, who was a martyr from the 16th century, who converted to Christianity and was essentially killed for it. And so the building becomes a kind of repository for relics, for remains, etc. Today, you can see that this is the barrel vault, and the entrance to the church is right behind here. But of course, Muslim prayer faces Mecca, and so the mihrab was placed in front of the door. As you said, the Turkish government funded the renovation, which is quite odd, in fact, but they have basically kept almost every element. I mean, this has been closed off, and I asked the imam to let me back there, and that wasn't going to happen. But they, at the very entrance, on the side entrance, they have placed, you see this in archaeology, sometimes in cities or old buildings that have dug up remains. They've placed a very thick piece of glass that you can walk over, and you can see tile work from the old Ketchaoua Mosque. But what's odd is that most people I spoke to don't know that this was a church. They think that this is the original Ketchaoua Mosque from who knows when. I mean, the Ketchaoua Mosque that was destroyed was a building from the 18th century. In fact, it wasn't all that old. It was about 50 years old. But it itself was built over a mosque that predated it, probably from the 16th century, although that history is a little bit murky. Does that answer your question? I mean, they haven't changed all that much, really, is I guess what I would say. You can see they've removed, of course, the whole decorative, all of the paintings, etc. The church, there is a cathedral in Algiers, and it is La Cathédrale de Sacré-Cœur, which is actually a beautiful modernist movement building that was started to be built as a church originally in early 50s, finished in 56 or so. So when they deconsecrated this cathedral, they moved the holdings of this cathedral to the Church of Sacré-Cœur, which then became a cathedral. Unfortunately, it was closed every time I visited when I was there. So, but I imagine that they also took the body. So in the basement was also the body of Dupuche, the first évêque, which is now in the modernist Béton Brut cathedral.
I'm wondering, were there other examples of churches or mosques that were converted into churches, or is this sort of like the mezquita that was a very clear symbol of religious power before, that was converted from Muslim to Christianity? Is this a similar case, or were there a lot of other smaller mosques that were then converted to churches and then back? And then a second question is, sometimes you refer to this is what the church wanted, and sometimes you refer to this is what France wanted. And I'm wondering if you could comment and clarify on that, because at the time, technically, the two were separated, and even though they were sort of working together here, in this case, was it more France or was it more the church?
It's part of the work I'm trying to do with the documents because they're working hand in hand in some cases, but sometimes real tensions emerge. So there are many documents. So, and to get to your first question, so this is one of many mosques that are converted, or at least taken from being a mosque or a Muslim religious institution to being warehouse, barracks, etc. So they did this, as I said, like from 176, they went down to 21 within the first few decades. So they're doing this, and it's funny to read the church's point of view on it. All right, if you read any of the pre-62, because the church is obsessed with its own history. In fact, makes it both easy and difficult to work on the church because they repeat things so often that they almost make it fact. But most of these, I guess that's religion. But the church is constantly, going back to this idea that the Muslims gave them these mosques, whereas if you do some research, you realize that that's not always the case. Although it might have been the case in certain moments. So that's still something that needs to be done. I mean, I know that I also need to understand. I think part of to continue this project, I want to understand not just what the French actions were and the French perceptions were, but how these actions and perceptions were met by Algerians who were involved in this story. And so their voice is not very clear here. That's part of the project. It's also the more difficult part of the project because my Arabic is very rudimentary. And to be honest, there are not that many accounts by Algerians of those early decades. But yes, the tensions between the church and the state are very real, but very often they agree on the issue of converting buildings and disagree on the issue of converting people. And that's also a question that I want to understand more fully, because it would seem that both would elicit anger in society, in Algerian society. And so why is one absolutely prohibited while the other is encouraged?
Is there any source of academic partners in Algeria on which you can work on these topics? I don't know it well, so I was curious about that.
I'm not the first to work on this, and I certainly won't be the last. There are Algerian scholars who work on this, most notably Nabila Sherif has worked on this topic. There are people French scholars who have worked on this topic. Nobody that I know has worked on the topic with a specificity on the church. So and in a way, that's how I'm trying to open up this question of Algeria is through this question of the church. So in that sense, I think, but these buildings, especially this building, has been studied. Although I think there is a lot more work to do on it. The documents are abundant and they're scattered in Algeria, in France, multiple places in France, including Aix-en-Provence and multiple sites in Paris. So what I'm trying to do right now is bring everything together and then set up timelines to understand how these things actually came about.
I was just wondering to what extent you could have partners.
Yeah.
In the work, I guess, because I don't know the subject.
Something I most definitely want to explore, especially if I could have interlocutors in Algeria that I could work with and discuss these ideas with, it would be fantastic.